In order to have someone believe something is the right thing to do, in order to really to begin to accept it, it takes 48 repetitions. 48 times they have to hear this. Right? And after that, they'll start to believe that, oh, that's the right thing to do. That's what we ought to be doing. That sort of thing. This is where you get them to veto, by the way. So just say no lasts a long time. Anybody ever wonder why it takes so long to move anything, to make any change happen, and that sort of thing? Well, there's a mechanical mechanism, or a neurological mechanism rather, working behind the scenes that's actually preventing that behavior from being disinhibited, from being encouraged, and it takes a lot of repetition for it to seem safe. Now, I won't go into the details of that right now, but if anyone wants to see it after the presentation, I'd be glad to talk turkey if you want, neurotransmitters and neurons and chemistry and all that kind of thing. Now, the goal here is to get someone to fully assimilate the idea. And that means moving them from believing it's the right thing to do, right, to absolutely knowing, right, that the idea was theirs to begin with. Okay? And that's the point of intentionally designed culture, is to reduce the amount of time necessary to get someone to believe that the idea you've been repeating for 64 times every single day for 2.5 months was really theirs. Now, they'll come up to you, they'll tell you when they're there. They'll come up to you and they'll say, I just had a great idea, why don't we do this? Okay? And at that point, the most important thing you can say is, that's wonderful. Let's go do that now, please. Okay? Because if you say, well, it's about time. What do you think? I've just spent 2 months telling you this. You get to start over again. Okay? They're going to, oh, what do you mean? You know, and they'll push back and they'll go back to no. Right? The point is to get them on board. The point is to have them embody that change and that behavior within their own belief space, within their own day-to-day routines. And getting them there then means that we have to accept the fact that they now see it, and it's as if it was brand new to them. All right, and that's really a good thing, because once they get there, they're really on board. So at this point, we'd say with this many repetitions, we have people on board. They're fully assimilated. They've gotten to let's go, and they're willing to take the action, accept the concepts, follow the processes, use your quality assurance measurements, everything like that, just like they're supposed to do, because they realize it's not only beneficial to me, but it's beneficial to everyone else. It's part of the team. The trade-off here is that by doing this work better, I make someone else's life easier downstream. And when they get to that focus, you've won. Right? So we start with them telling you no, and we get to the end of this when they're fully assimilated, and you've won. Okay? So that kind of lays out the structure a little bit of how we see change affected. Right? We'll talk about this a little bit later. We find that this operates really well in the absence of a reward system. And we'll talk about why reward systems don't necessarily work the way we think they do or would expect them to, and why sometimes this approach is actually some better. But we also need to talk about 64 repetitions, right? If you sit down with someone and you just repeat the same thing 64 times in a row, it's not going to work, right? As a matter of fact, what we found is that there's a measurement. You're limited to one effective expression per day per person, which means that the soonest that you could get someone on board is 64 repetitions, therefore 64 days if you went to their house on weekends. Right? Things like that. So now we're talking about several months long. Now, how many people would continue to attend a half-hour meeting in a workplace where you talked about the same thing every day? Right? How long would you actually sign up for that meeting? Right? So the real fact is you're lucky if you can get them once a week. And maybe you can get them once a week to a repeating meeting where you can express these ideas, repeat this information to them, and then after 64 weeks, then you're probably going to see them fully assimilate that idea. You'll notice about 48 to 50 weeks, they start to take ownership for that meeting. They'll schedule it, they'll invite people, that sort of thing. But we're limited in this case, so there's a constraint. The reason there's a constraint here is the human mind is really good at compressing information. So the same thing happens multiple times in the day, it only applies that knowledge as if it happened once. And they have to sleep on it. It has to process through. These changes have to work their ways deeper into the neural network, if you will, and establish the context better, more strongly, so that it repeats and it disinhibits correctly. So knowing that there's a limitation on this, right? Knowing that we're limited, and at best we're going to see change happen in 64 days, give or take a bit, but more likely in most business organizations, 64 weeks. Right? Anybody have a change process or been involved in a change effort that lasted for a year? Or more than a year? More. Sorry? More. Or more, yeah. Yep, and many times. We'll see why, in fact, in just a second. This was for one idea. When we talk about deploying process, we talk about deploying significant change to deliver benefit, that golden gleaming city approach. We need more than one idea, more than one change to happen, more than one concept. What we've discovered is that software processes, and this actually we found applies to many other general processes, but specifically for software processes, there are 25 concepts that need to be assimilated into an organization in order to achieve full benefit out of that process. Right? Anybody heard how wonderful a process is going to be? Yeah, okay. So the whole tone of that response tells me, yeah, right, okay. Right? Anybody not get the full benefit they wanted out of it? Right? We would say, oh, it's probably because some of these concepts were missing, and because those concepts were missing, the process wasn't able to establish a self-sustaining, fully beneficial operation within the organization. Now, there's even some sequencing to how these have to go in. So we can't just pick one and start. What we really have to do is there's a critical path map, for example, and we have more detailed stuff that shows that. But there's a sequence in which you introduce both behaviors and concepts and then the processes that you want to put in place. So knowing that we have this much work ahead of us, and knowing that it takes 64 repetitions to affect each one of these changes within the organization, right, we can get a measure for the time required for self-sustaining change. Okay, if we work back 25 concepts, right, one effective expression per day, at 64 expressions per concept. If you'll trust me on the math, it comes out to roughly, best case, 54 months. Yep. Almost 5 years in order to truly achieve the benefit that was promised originally. Okay? Now, just by show of hands, if you would, how many people think that any organization has the resources or the chutzpah to support that kind of a change or that kind of a change effort over 5 years? No hands up. Okay. Right? Now, if you're in the middle of that, of trying to affect change and you haven't given it 5 years, or anybody been on one that stopped at 2 years? A couple people, 1 year, 3 years, things like that. We could make the statement, you stopped a little too early. Okay? If you've been working change for 4 years, don't stop, you're almost there. Right? It's really about to kick in for you. Right? If you haven't been working on it for 4 years yet, we've got something that might help. Right? But the point is, and the stake we want to put in the ground here is, we've measured at 54 months. The time required under best case circumstances. That's almost a daily expression of change in these concepts in order to put an organization in place. Meeting once a week or so, things like that. It's about 20 years. Which could help explain why so many organizations struggle with change. We always say change is difficult, change is hard to do. Right? Well, this is one of the reasons, because we so seldom see good results back. Okay? Now, our focus then is how can we reduce that duration? That's the big problem, is that it takes so long to affect change, we'll never get the benefit. Right? It's simply not going to work for us. So we want to reduce the duration using intentionally designed culture, and now we've hit the core of the reason for the development of intentionally designed culture. Most organizations, when they go to affect change, well, they make it somebody's job. They put somebody out there and said, okay, go face into the wind and get everybody else to join you. Right? So we have our poor little change agent here facing into the wind, and nobody else is looking the same way. If you work in software quality, you probably know this feeling. Right? And so this is a single agent approach. This is the way a lot of change efforts begin, and it's unfortunately a lot of way change efforts end. Right? What we'd rather do with intentionally designed culture is create the self-replicating change that begins to move through the organization, and every part of the organization that it begins to touch begins to make copies of that change in other parts of the organization, so that pretty soon we have this huge network of change happening, and we've distributed the effort for that change into a we call it a collaborative IDC approach.